I'm Janet Silver. Alberta's United Conservative Party, led by Daniel Smith, won another majority government on Monday. Yet the win is not without costs. A few cabinet ministers lost their seats, and the province has shown some deep divisions. And of course, this win has repercussions for the province's relations with Ottawa. So how might this all play out? Joining me to break all of this down are two experienced political operatives and my colleagues here at Syntax, Jon Dugal and Jake Enwright. And Jake, I'm going to start with you. Daniel Smith holds on to power in Alberta, but with a diminished majority. And if you look at the elections results maps, Edmonton went NDP, several Calgary ridings also went NDP, yet pretty much everywhere else went UCP, United Conservative Party. What do you make of this urban-rural divide?
Well, it probably speaks to the changing demographic you're noticing in Western societies writ large, where more and more people are going to jurisdictions that have low taxes, and that's then impacting the political makeup of those jurisdictions. You're seeing that in the United States considerably. I think you're seeing it here. The rural-urban divide is not new in Canada. It's just new to Alberta politics. To go back to your point, though, about a diminished majority, I don't think there's such a thing. A win is a win, especially in Alberta, where there's two parties and you don't have to worry about the left or the right now splitting the vote. I think the more concerning thing that the party has learned throughout the last month of campaigning with Danielle Smith is she going to be effective in governing the province? The party largely had to hide her for the better part of a month, and that speaks to the question of whether or not she can effectively deliver on the mandate she's been given and effectively deliver on the communications required to explain that mandate to a increasingly, I won't use the word divided, but more diverse political landscape in Alberta.
John, when we look at the voter turnout, it was down in this election about almost 5% or just over 5%. NDP leader and former Premier Rachel Notley has vowed to stay on as party leader. She hasn't won the last two elections. What are some of the considerations when a leader is not able to bring it home and has, gone through that race before, in terms of a party sticking with the leader?
I'm going to start with a comment on how you opened that question, actually, because I'm just noticing a trend, right? Like Ontario last year significantly reduced voter turnout. PEI this spring, where normally you're seeing voter turnout rates well above 75%, if not 80%, significantly down in the 60s. Now Alberta significantly down yet again. This is a little bit concerning to especially us as practice political people, but it just speaks maybe more to apathy across the board around politics in the current state. And Jake hesitated to use the word divisiveness earlier in terms of Alberta politics, and I think that was the right call in terms of just looking at the sheer makeup of the legislature there. I think it is more diverse, and that's going to reflect that. But maybe this whole last 10-ish years in politics, not just in Canada, it's not a local thing to us, it's around the world. You see it in the United States with Donald Trump. You see that in France with Emmanuel Macron going against a pretty fiercely right-wing party over in France as well. There's division everywhere, and maybe that is leading to these lower turnout votes. So that's the first comment. As it relates to Rachel Notley and kind of the calculations that a party will make in terms of keeping on a leader, I actually think in this case, it's not a calculation that the party's going to make. It has more to do with the calculation that Rachel Notley is going to make. And I say that simply because the party hasn't really been anything without Rachel Notley. It was Rachel Notley that delivered them a provincial government in 2015. It's Rachel Notley that held them to an opposition in 2019, and it's Rachel Notley that secured 10 more seats, 10 new seats, I should say, 11 net new in the legislature this time. So, as it relates to her leadership, I don't think you can have a real referendum on her success because she is in a predominantly conservative province. She has delivered a majority government once, and she's secured a couple considerable opposition mandates now over the last two cycles. And when you look in the wings, it's not like there's necessarily a challenger waiting right there that's omnipresent, that's very apparent to everyone involved, whether it's internally to the party or to the public. So I think this has more to do with calculations that Rachel Notley will make around her own grip of power on the party versus what the calculations the party would have to make. And that being whether it's the party apparatus in terms of, do we need to start thinking of a leadership review or a leadership campaign, or the party membership themselves of, do we need to get rid of Rachel Notley to be able to form government? Because I don't think that calculation exists for those two parties.
I have no idea how Rachel Notley justifies staying on as leader, other than the fact that the left does not consume their own like conservatives do. After an election loss, the left tends to martyr their leaders. The reality is that Rachel Notley isn't an unknown commodity with nowhere to go but up. She's been premier before. She's been defeated twice. That assumes then that there is a limit and on Alberta's appetite for her as premier. The election itself was also a massive missed opportunity. Conservatives, on the UCP campaign are now admitting that 2 to 3 weeks into the campaign, they thought they were going to lose the campaign. The opposition research that the NDP had done on Ms. Smith was deep. It was effective, which is not common for opposition research, and it was having a real result on the ground in key ridings, and yet the NDP and Ms. Notley took their foot off the gas pedal. I don't understand how publicly you portray your opponent as some villain, but you sit on top of the opposition research that might enhance and reinforce the message you're delivering to the public. It was a massive missed opportunity. And to John's point, if there was anybody actually waiting in the wings, Ms. Notley would have resigned long ago. It's a lack of leadership within the party and a successor, which is resulting in the reason she's staying on.
I just want to pull this back a little bit to Ottawa then. In terms of Danielle Smith's win in Alberta, she even said herself that night, on Monday night when she won, she went right on the attack in terms of the Ottawa and the government over resources. Who, in terms of Ottawa, Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative Party leader, endorsed Danielle Smith. I'm just wondering, depending on how she governs, could that be a bit of a risk for him, Jake? And also then to you, John, in terms of Ottawa, what does that mean in terms of relations between the federal government and Alberta?
Depends how you define risk for Pierre Poilievre. He and his team don't define risk as uncomfortable media questions. I think given his endorsement of Ms. Smith, it will likely come to pass that he will be questioned whether or not he supports her various decisions. And sometimes those decisions are going to be uncomfortable, and sometimes they're going to be very unpopular outside of Alberta. I think for Mr. Poilievre, that will be a constant theme up until the next election. If you look back at 21 and how the Liberals took on Aaron O'Toole, they used Jason Kenney and his response to COVID-19 to draw parallels between how the two leaders would govern. They're going to do the exact same thing. When the chips are down, Liberals go back to basics. And I think no one will argue that regardless of when a federal election is called, the chips will certainly be down for the Liberals. For Justin Trudeau, if I'm him, I'm looking at the situation and I'm worried that perhaps the country might elect a leader who is, while unpopular and controversial, that the public might side with the leader who has an issue set and ownership over the economic question and disregard the values-based questions we now put so much emphasis on in Canadian politics.
I'd agree with Jake there. As far as, the relationship between Alberta and Ottawa, or even just across the Dominion more broadly, I don't think this is going to have much of an impact at all. She's returning to a majority government that she had in the first place. Yes, she lost a couple seats, but like Jake said, there's no majority government that's not a good majority government, right? So from that sense, nothing changes. And actually, what's maybe more interesting to me is that, yes, the night of the election, she did come out and attack Justin Trudeau head on, specifically for the climate policies. But then the next morning, she seemingly backtracked a little bit in terms of coming out and saying she wants to reset that relationship. So what that looks like in practice, I'm not too sure after the comments she made the night before. But nonetheless, that was a bit interesting to me, just to see that slight reversal, granted not totally, but even in terms of what Jake was saying, I think this has to be a bit of a wake-up call for the Trudeau Liberals as well, because yes, negative ads work. Yes, nasty elections work in terms of, securing a victory. However, we've had two successive elections now where the Liberals have run on the boogeyman and they haven't gotten the result that they wanted. Facts are facts, and at some point, I want to look back at this campaign too and think to myself, and Jake, actually, I'd be really interested to your thoughts on this, having run a war room before and having been responsible for the daily unleash of Oppo, that I wonder if Rachel Notley bit off a bit more than, and the NDP bit off a bit more than they could chew in the Oppo perspective, because to me, from the East Coast, it seemed like the only stories I was hearing from Alberta and the campaign in general was a daily new topic of what did Danielle Smith say or do 5, 10, 15, 2 years ago, or even 2 months ago, or even 2 weeks ago. It seemed like daily there was something new that was in the news that was negative about Ms. Smith. So I wonder if they rushed it in terms of releasing it daily rather than letting things sit. And for the Liberals, I wonder if they might learn from that in terms of letting a couple things bake out a little more, just to really kind of entrench it. Which again, like in a short election cycle, you do have to take your shots daily. But I wonder if they'll perhaps try to draw some lessons from that and apply it to the federal level with Pierre Poilievre over the next couple of years.
I think the lesson from an opposition research perspective in a campaign isn't so much the strategy you deploy. You're handed the circumstances you are every day. And to your point, John, you're kind of just getting up and firing and seeing what lands. In an ideal scenario, you plan these things out and you try to drag them out over as many days as possible. But I think the mistake that Notley and the NDP made was the fact that they seemed to get cold feet over their opposition research. There was a lot of feedback they were getting that they're being too negative. And that is a gross miscalculation about what Oppo research does. When you are sitting in a war room deploying hits in the media every day, you probably aren't influencing votes one way or the other. But what you are doing is distracting your opponent from doing the things that are necessary to influence those votes vis-a-vis advertising, on the ground campaigning. The air war, as we call it, is just that, the air war. And it's meant to provide cover to the ground war in a campaign, to steal some military terminology. And so I think they grossly miscalculated what they were exactly doing with their opposition research, and they let their foot off the gas pedal. It allowed the Conservatives to get up off the mat in week 3, and they ended up winning. In terms of what we might see next out of Alberta and how that plays a role in the federal relationship, it's going to be really interesting to see where the priorities are for Ms. Smith. We've heard reports from Conservative operatives inside the campaign war room that she doesn't like talking about the economy. If she wants to have a conversation with Ottawa about the economy, I don't think that worries Justin Trudeau one way or another. If she wants to engage in a US-style culture war with Justin Trudeau, this will have the Liberal Prime Minister salivating at the opportunity, and this will become very untenable and very dangerous for the federal Conservatives moving forward.
I just want to go back to something, Jake, you had brought up earlier in terms of the campaign messages, campaign promises. Because during the campaign, Danielle Smith was talking about resources, right? And we know that Alberta is doing really well in terms of resource royalties, right? Provincial Treasury is doing well. Oil prices are high. And she had talked about during the campaign, one of her promises was a cut to personal income taxes. In other words, a lot is riding high on the continued success, if you will, of royalties from oil resources. And I'm wondering what happens when those prices drop. If it plays out, Jake, as you were saying, potentially a more contentious relationship with Ottawa, where does that all go?
I don't think the Smith people are all that concerned about that. Alberta historically has been one of the lowest tax jurisdictions in Canada. It has always been the result of revenues from commodities. And I think this is not a new issue that Alberta has had to tackle as a friend's dad used to joke with us, he said, boys, the West rises and she falls. And that's just the nature of a resource dependent economy. Whether or not that hurts her ultimately at the polls. I guess that's to be determined. I think one thing on the economy that struck me was I didn't think that Danielle Smith spent a lot of time talking about the economy, despite the fact that they were ultimately able to successfully frame the campaign ballot box question around the economy. If you look at week 1, 2 into week 3 in the campaign, the NDP were dictating the narrative. It was all about healthcare, and the UCP and Danielle Smith seemed to be feeding into that narrative and trying to combat it rather than just pivoting and talking about what they thought was the priority. When the NDP then came out and announced their hike on corporate taxes, that allowed the UCP to properly pivot toward the economy, and it happened to be on an issue that was deeply unpopular with the majority of residents in Alberta.
I just want to bring it back to Ottawa. We're in the last couple of weeks before the House rises for the summer recess. Jon, is there anything that you're going to be watching to see what happens, and what does the government have to get passed before MPs go back to their ridings?
I mean, really, the only thing they have to get passed is the budget. There's a couple other government bills on the table, particularly the first update to the Canada Environmental Protection Act in some time. There's also disability support on the table. There's also online privacy bills. So there's a number of things going across the line. And actually, of interest to me and of interest to everybody in Atlantic Canada, Jonathan Wilkinson just tabled today or yesterday, I guess, a new bill that would be about supporting the offshore energy industry in Atlantic Canada, specifically around renewable resources like wind power and renewable hydrogen development. That's really interesting, especially there's a lot of the economic components there. And of course, they just renegotiated the Canada Health Transfer this year. So passing the budget is a big deal for them in terms of being able to deliver on what in many minds will be a landmark piece for this government moving forward. But really, I think they just have to survive. With the NDP now coming out the other day, granted, talking out of both sides of their mouths, where leader Jagmeet Singh came out and said, I'm not going to call an election before we can re-entrench confidence of Canadians into the electoral system. And then the next day coming out with a pretty strongly worded motion that would actually impose a duty on the House, potentially, if it passes as worded, to actually, try to get rid of David Johnston as a special rapporteur, restart the whole process at a committee level, if not going to a full-on public inquiry. The government's going to need to get through this. Now, it is interesting because that reference and that motion, which will inevitably pass with support from the Bloc and the Conservatives, is going to have to go to the House committee that is already having 2 studies ongoing around this whole foreign interference and the Chinese interference dilemma, let's call it. So with them sitting in extra time already just to conduct those 2 studies, it's going to be interesting as to whether or not the committee would actually have the capacity to get to that study before the end of session. And so to me, that actually maybe raises another question, which is, for later this summer, is would the government consider proroguing the House, depending on the status of those committee studies after they pass the budget and maybe a couple pieces of government legislation this year, resetting the cabinet, coming back next fall with a fresh team, a new team that's going to take them into an election likely to happen sometime in 2024.
2 things. One, the line Jagmeet Singh had yesterday about being unable to force an election until we get answers around electoral integrity will go down as one of these stupidest explanations in Canadian politics. The idea that the people of this country can't have a say in their government because someone has actively, a foreign power nonetheless has actively interfered in their say to have the government they want, whether that had an outcome, whether that had an impactful outcome or not, it has to be one of the dumbest explanations to justify one's political flip-flopping in history. The second thing I'll say is that by the end of June, David Johnston will resign as special rapporteur. If you watch what Mr. Johnston's doing, this proactive, we'll call it proactive, reactive approach, as I like to call it, in trying to defend himself, highlights that either he has someone in his ear on a personal level saying that he is getting carpet bombed and embarrassed over this mess, or the government themselves are telling him that he has to get off the mat and defend himself. Nonetheless, when someone in a position like his isn't shrugging his shoulders and just soldiering on and is actively trying to explain himself, it probably means that we're getting close to the end. And I think the end will be by at the end of June when Mr. Johnson resigns his position.
Well, we're in for a couple of interesting weeks, that's for sure. Thank you to my colleagues, Jake Enwright and Jon Dugal. That's all the time we have for today. Till next time.